So, uh, so the Navy bombed Vieques, bombed the eastern end of Vieques for about a half a century. According to Navy documents, they dropped millions of pounds of explosives on Vieques. We know about napalm, we know about depleted uranium, we fear that other contaminants, Agent Orange, may have been used here. We haven't got any evidence of that yet, but we fear that. The Navy used every type of weapon that was used in military activity from the 1940s up until 2003 on Vieques. Vieques was a practice area, it was a place to experiment with new weapon systems. It was a place for major U.S. weapons manufacturers to come and show off their munitions and practice with them as well. So an intense amount of contamination and unexploded ordnance remains on the eastern end, particularly from that bombing activity. Vieques was used, as I mentioned, for pretty much every military activity from the world, from World War II up until 2003, at least that had to do with the Atlantic Fleet. 1954, the Guatemala invasion of Guatemala, the overthrow of the Arbenz government was partially rehearsed in Vieques. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in '61 was also prepared for in Vieques. It's both Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans here with U.S. Marines practicing on beaches in Vieques. The U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965, when 17,000 Marines invaded the Dominican Republic to put in a pro-U.S. government there. Vieques was extensively used for preparations. Throughout the Vietnam War, Vieques was heavily used. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. For the coup in Chile in 1973, there were some special communications maneuvers that took place here in function of that coup. The invasion of Grenada, 1983 in October, was rehearsed in Vieques in the largest peacetime military maneuvers in U.S. history that were called Ocean Venture 83. Thousands of troops and jets and ships and tanks and prepared for the invasion of Grenada in July here, June, July, and then invaded Grenada in October. Invasion of Panama in 1989, that to arrest Noriega was the excuse, but obviously to practice with stealth jets and other munitions. Vieques was used for that, as well as a series of other operations, the activities against El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 70s and 80s. Vieques was constantly used for maneuvers that included not just U.S. military forces, but the OTAN, the NATO forces, and Ameritas, the American, South American militaries that were allies of the U.S. also practiced here. So Vieques was extensively used. The first Gulf War, Yugoslavia, the Balkans. And we feel, very happy that not only did the bombing stop here and thereby allowing Vieques a chance for the first time in half a century to begin a healing process, but to know that the Navy can no longer use this particular space to carry out its diabolic military activity in other places is also a very important victory for us.
And with respect to the contaminant itself, how do you see that in...
I'm getting up, you may notice that. Getting up because I just happen to have a document here that I'm going to hand out to these kids called Vieques and Ecology Besieged, something I put together several years ago. Kind of a summary of pieces from several Puerto Rican scientists who describe the damage. There have been a lot of environmental scientific studies done. Neftali Garcia did I guess one of the early important studies called Historic and Natural Consequences of the presence of the U.S. Navy in Vieques. A very good detailed study about the destruction to mangrove lagoons by the building of Navy roads in their western and eastern ends here, and also obviously the destruction from the bombing itself. Viequense chemical engineer Rafael Cruz Perez did a very good study about the air transportation of particles from the bombing range to the civilian area. Very important study in the mid-'80s that indicated RDX, one of the principal components of explosives, was found in the drinking water in the town in Esperanza, I mean, many miles away, in the drinking water cisterns of Esperanza. I mean, there are many other things that he talks about, but he also, describes these long lists of the types of chemicals, and not different from most of the other U.S. military bases throughout the world. All these horrible heavy metals and nitrates and nitrites, and just a lot of bad stuff that causes a lot of damage and sadness to many people. We've had studies done by Dr. Cruz Maria Nazario, an epidemiologist from the University of Puerto Rico's School of Public Health. And she has helped us to get a lot of documentation from the Health Department of Puerto Rico, and also from the University of Puerto Rico's own documentation center. So she was one of the first people to help us get the information about Vieques having actually a 30% higher cancer case rate than the rest of Puerto Rico. Dr. Colón de Jorge, a woman who's done a lot of work with Viequense patients, has found a lot of contamination, high dangerous levels of mercury, lead, cadmium, aluminum, arsenic in people from Vieques. Dr. Ortiz Roque, a woman gynecologist, has done important studies indicating very high levels of mercury, particularly in workers on the base here in Vieques that used to work here when the base was operating, and in fishermen as well. And also more recently, a study indicated high levels of mercury in women, young women of childbearing ages. There are also others, a series of other studies, Fernandez Porto, Dr. Arturo Masol, Dr. Zavala, who again have described very scientifically the immense amount of heavy metals in the food chain, in people, in our environment, and all of this obviously has its manifestations in the health of our community. This is a community besieged. The Navy stopped bombing in 2003, but we are still under attack, and this is something that we know will go on for a long time. This beautiful breeze, unfortunately, comes directly from the bombing range. So, when we have hurricanes here, or tropical storms, or just heavy winds, different from other communities where that might mean, some trees get broken or there may be other damage. Here it also means large amounts of military toxics get into the civilian area, get into our, school areas and backyards and into people's faces. So, the Navy, the military contamination here has had and will continue to have a profound impact on Vieques and its people for a long, long time.
And so by extension, with the use of uranio reducido in the weapons, that would also be present, because there's evidence that is used as well, right?
Yeah, we're very concerned about the use of depleted uranium. We first learned here in the community about depleted uranium, what it was, at a meeting, I believe it was in the early 90s. I remember Ismael Guadalupe and I and a team of people from Vieques went to a conference in Washington on environmental justice, environmental racism, and there were some people there from, I believe from Arizona, Nevada area, and they were the first to ever talk to us about depleted uranium. We had no idea what it was. And, armed with photographs of this stuff and photographs of its impact on metal like tanks, Ismael and Prieto Ventura, one of Vieques fishermen, went out to the bombing range shortly after our return from that conference, and sure enough found some tanks with these types of perforations that are very characteristic of the melting of the metal that happens with the pyromorphic depleted uranium rounds. And the Navy, denied for years that they used depleted uranium, until finally, through a Freedom of Information Act request, they admitted, but only they admitted it in the strangest way. They said, well, yes, we did use depleted uranium, but only one time, and it was an accident. The wrong pilot put the wrong munitions on the wrong jet and flew it to the wrong place. But after firing off only 253 rounds, realized the mistake. Obviously to minimize the damage and to continue this sort of lying process about how much of this horrible, wicked stuff is around. So we're still obviously looking for more detailed information, and we fear that since Vieques was a principal experimentation place and training ground for the military from particularly in that period of the 50s, 60s, 70s, when depleted uranium began to, was surfaced as a good weapon for the military. We fear that a lot of that stuff was used here, and so we're certainly concerned about the effects of depleted uranium here.
What kind of interventions do you foresee with respect to this kind of contamination?
Well, this is, we would like to see the cleanup that's taking place now done in the most intensive and careful possible, ways. Unfortunately, the Navy has opted for open detonation of bombs as their way to get rid of the stuff cheap and quickly, and unfortunately with horrible consequences, repercussions for the community. So we're concerned that they might be blowing up some of these, depleted uranium rounds, or that some of these rounds may blow up, in the process of this open detonation that the Navy's carrying on now. We bring up the topic of depleted uranium is brought up at each one of the RAB meetings, and the military, they don't even want to talk about it. They just say, well, look, we found those that we could, and there was just this. They stick very strongly to this notion that they only shot off those accidental 253 rounds. This is something that we're concerned about, and we obviously need more intervention to clean up, particularly the depleted uranium rounds. Depleted uranium, we fear that other contaminants, Agent Orange, may have been used here. We haven't got any evidence of that yet, but we fear that. The Navy used every type of weapon that was used in military activity from the 1940s up until 2003 on Vieques. Vieques was a practice area. It was a place to experiment with new weapon systems. It was a place for major U.S. weapons manufacturers to come and show off their munitions and practice with them as well. So an intense amount of contamination and unexploded ordnance remains on the eastern end, particularly from that bombing activity. Vieques was used, as I mentioned, for pretty much every military activity. Both Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans here with U.S. Marines practicing on beaches in Vieques. The U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965, when 17,000 Marines invaded the Dominican Republic to put in a pro-U.S. government there. Vieques was extensively used for preparations. Throughout the Vietnam War, Vieques was heavily used. So the Navy bombed Vieques, bombed the eastern end of Vieques for about a half a century. According to Navy documents, they dropped millions of pounds of explosives on Vieques. We know about napalm. We know about activity from World War II up until 2003, at least that had to do with the Atlantic Fleet. 1954, the Guatemala invasion of Guatemala, the overthrow of the Arbenz government was partially rehearsed in Vieques. The Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in '61 was also prepared for in Vieques.